right, everyone. Well, welcome. mm. Michael, Zoe, welcome. Welcome to another lecture here. Anyone else joining us for more world history goodness? Cushy, welcome. Hello. Thank you all for joining me. Josh. And look at this, we got a Mochi cat. We got a Mochi who came and visited us. Well, hello there, Mochi. Karan, how's it going? Nicholas Cabrera, good to see you. We got a Mochi here. Look at Mochi, he's such a sweet cat. Honestly, he's like the sweetest cat ever. Isn't that right, buddy? You smell good. There you go. All right, so welcome. Just waiting for folks to join in here. I just put the link up on Schoology, so hopefully a few more folks will join. Okay, so talking a bit about the interwar years. So just out of curiosity, I wonder if any of you actually did the, here, let me double check this here, see who did this and who didn't. You may have seen this assignment here on the Hitler docu-series that I had you do. I'm checking right now to see who did that. So let's see here. Kudos to the following if you uploaded this: Josh, Nicholas, Giselle, Zoe Cushy, Joshua Quiot, Michaela Melsch, Charles Vargas, and August Wetterow. Thank you all so much for submitting those assignments. Some of you may have submitted them before, but that is who I have on record as having completed the Hitler Rise of Evil video questions that I had on last time's distance learning lesson. Now, if you didn't do it, it's not going to affect your grade, but if you did do it, maybe it'll give you a few points here that will help in bringing your grade up. So today's live lecture is going to be on similar material from the same time period. We're just going to continue moving forward through the class and covering material. And so today's lecture, for the first part of today's online lesson, and it's not going to be super long, probably bring us up to about 11 o'clock or so. I've already done a lecture today, and I did a lecture last night for my college class. So I've been doing a lot of these online lectures recently. So I'm gonna pop down over here to this PowerPoint and show you this, and kind of catch you up to speed on where we left off here with talking about totalitarianism. We talked about fascism last class. I don't want to cover all the same thing over again, but I do want to make our way through the things that we need to know. We talked about Kristallnacht. We talked about Mussolini. We talked about the differences between communism and fascism last time. And we also talked about the rise of Hitler as Chancellor of Germany, where he legally took power starting in 1933 after being named Chancellor by not Otto von Bismarck, by Paul von Hindenburg. And Paul von Hindenburg previously was a general. We talked about that. Talked about Mein Kampf. What else did we talk about? We talked about Hitler's oratory abilities. He was a great speech giver. He used speeches as well as other methods of propaganda to relay his message, which was a message, of course, that had a lot to do with racial German superiority messages and the hateful rhetoric surrounding Jewish folks and other people in Germany who Hitler classified as burdens to the state. We talked about the concept of Lebensraum, where Hitler wanted to expand the borders of Germany to take over areas and get all German peoples living in the same state. We talked about how the stock market had this effect on Hitler's rule, where he was able to utilize the fear, the unemployment, the economic upheaval of the Great Depression after the crash of the stock market in 29 to be able to get his party back out there and start tapping into that fear and whenever I talked to you last time about whenever populations feel fearful, they're always looking for that strong man to come in and fix things. Mentioned Kristallnacht, where Night of Broken Glass, where they went in and they started tearing up Jewish homes, businesses, synagogues, and then ended up arresting them and many times making the Jewish folks pay for the damages done against them. You do see other fascists in Germany. During the Great Depression, during the 1930s, there are a number of different states that fall under fascist rule, particularly in Eastern Europe. The further we go into the interwar years, the less confidence people have in democratic-style democracies, and what ends up happening over time is that these places give way to being taken over by either kings or dictatorial-style rulers themselves. The only place, the last bastion of democracy in Central/Eastern Europe is going to be Czechoslovakia, and there's a slight sadness to that because. Yeah, the Hitler movie assignment was the only thing due. Yeah, sorry, I just saw that message right now. The sadness about the situation with Czechoslovakia is Czechoslovakia becomes a bargaining chip for peace between Britain and Germany, and or maintaining peace. So what we see happen in the interwar years is increasingly Germany under Hitler is becoming very, very nationalistic, which stands to reason because he is, after all, a Nazi. He's a fascist, okay? He is trying to spread German nationalism and the message of German superiority, and he is going to take this message beyond the borders of Germany when World War II breaks out. But even before the war breaks out, he is already chipping away at lands that had been determined no longer to belong to Germany after the Treaty of Versailles. And one of those regions is in Czechoslovakia. And that's why it's so sad that Czechoslovakia is actually the last remaining democracy. They were staunch defenders of democratic government in Czechoslovakia. And Britain comes over and basically says, "Yeah, you can take over part of you can take over the Sudetenland." So there's an area called the Sudetenland, Sudetenland, Sudetenland. And the Sudetenland was an area. Let me show you a map here. Actually, maybe I can pull this up. German. Well, this is Treaty of Versailles. Let's do this. Perfect. Perfect. All right, this is exactly the map that I want to show you right here. Okay, let's, can we zoom this in at all? Let's see if we can zoom this in. I know you can't see it yet. I'm going to open this in a new window. Let's see if we can zoom. There we go. Perfect. All right, nice. Now let's go over here so you can see what I'm actually looking at. All right, check this out. This here, right in this region here, if you can see these areas, let me see. I wonder if I can close this. There we go. All right, perfect. Now, this is the territories of Germany, and I want to draw your attention to a couple of certain regions on this map, okay? So these regions over here, this region by the Ruhr River and the Ruhr River Valley and the Rhine River right here, okay, are demilitarized areas. The German military was not allowed to enter these regions. Now, in 1936, okay, 1936, Hitler marches the German military back into these regions here, and of course they're welcomed because these are German territories. But this land down here in green, okay, kind of this pale green color, all right, this land had been given over to France. So Germany had lost this land here, and the border between France was right here. Nowadays, the border is where this line is right here, this pokey horn off the side of France, the eastern side of France is where the modern day border is. But during this time, these lands over here, which were traditionally like mixed French-German regions, okay, were given over to France. And so this is Alsace-Lorraine right here, basically. Now, over on this side, you have a corridor that divided the German nation into Germany and East Prussia. And this land in the middle here, where Danzig, which is a port city, was given actually over to Poland. And this was considered a monstrosity by German Nazis leading up to World War II. They really resented losing this territory and giving Poland, which had a huge Jewish population, this territory up leading to the Baltic Sea here. So this was seen as a monstrosity to cut this swath of land out of Germany and hand it over to another nation. Now, what about Czechoslovakia, which is what prompted this whole conversation in the first place? One thing you don't see here is this border region. You can see this is Czechoslovakia. You can see Czechoslovakia kind of protrudes into the side of Germany here. It's almost like it's a finger poking the side of Germany, right? And so this region, this border region here, actually has a whole bunch of what were known as Sudeten Germans. Sudeten Germans. In fact, I'll even spell that for you up here. I'm talking about this word right here, Sudeten land. Okay, Sudeten land. That's how it's spelled. And this region here gets given over to Germany. So Germany swallows up these border regions here of Sudeten Germans when Hitler pressures Britain to give these lands over. Now, when he takes those lands over, it's under the condition that that's the last straw, no more after that. Well, shortly thereafter, Germany just gobbles up all of Czechoslovakia. And that is why it's so sad that Czechoslovakia is like the last bastion of democracy in Central Eastern Europe. And they get taken over, and no one defends them. Even the other democratic nations in Europe don't defend Czechoslovakia when it gets taken over, and that's really a shame. It's really too bad. So it gives you an idea of kind of what I'm talking about, and I'm just kind of setting up here some of the changes that take place leading into World War II, because that's really where we're going to be headed next, is talking about the path or the road to war. And how we actually end up getting to World War II in the first place. But a lot of it has to do with people losing faith in democracies. Okay, so the democracies that remain are going to be in Western Europe. After Czechoslovakia gets swallowed up, gobbled up by all of Germany, then now the last remaining places are going to be Britain, France, and your Scandinavian countries. Sweden, Norway, and Finland tended to be more democratic. They all had strong democratic traditions there. Now, by the mid-1930s, there's basically, in Europe, you got now two kinds of countries. You got democratic nations, and you have totalitarian nations. So now the totalitarian nations can then be further subdivided because you can have fascist totalitarian nations or you can have communist totalitarian nations. And so those are the two types of totalitarian nations that you have. Now, fascists during this time started to militarize. They start strengthening up their militaries. They start devoting new industries to the advancement of like planes and military vehicles, ammunition, what else? All sorts of different things. The main idea here basically being that these fascist nations want to build up their militaries because they are so convinced that their nations are superior to others, that superior nations conquer, weak nations get conquered. And this is a very social Darwinist view. So when we talk about social Darwinism, this is a concept that is embraced by fascists of this time because there's a belief that some people are superior to others, and there's a belief that other people are inferior to others, and some of that is determined, according to them, by eugenics, which was a pseudoscience of bloodlines and other things like that, blood purity, which of course is nowadays, we look at that as a bunch of nonsense. It also it's extremely racist, and it generally supports the idea of European conquest over colonial holdings, right? That's social Darwinism had a precedent going back to the age of of imperialism, where European nations thought of themselves as superior to, say, Africans or Asians or other folks like that, and then they went in and took over those lands under the notion of white man's burden, which we talked about in class back in February. So during this time, we start to see aggressors invade nations. So as Germany, Italy, and Japan start to conquer and take over new places, basically no one does anything to stop them. The question is, who starts World War II? Is it Germany? Is it Japan? Technically, Japan invades China years before Germany invades Poland. If we go back even further, is it France that starts World War II? Because technically they're the ones who dictated the terms of the Treaty of Versailles in the first place. So depending on which historian you ask, you might get different answers as to who starts World War II. Some people say it's France. Some people say it's Germany. Some people say it's not even in Europe. It's Japan that starts World War II with the Second Sino-Japanese War, where Japan invades Manchuria, which is northern China, in 1937, I think it is. So I'm not saying that there's one right answer to this question. What I'm saying is that the answer depends on the evidence that you're using. So when it comes to how did World War II start, we look at long-term causes, but we also look at short-term, immediate causes. So the long-term causes, of course, of World War II are going to be, number one, Treaty of Versailles, obviously, okay, punishing Germany and not really sticking to all of the terms of punishment. Because let's face it, by the time that the 30s roll around and the Great Depression has taken place and stuff like that, a lot of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles by that point are already being ignored. And then, too, you had like a somewhat of a sympathetic vibe from America towards Germany in the mid-20s, where the Dawes Plan gets enacted and they give a giant loan to German industries so it gets their economy turned back around. So a lot of the Treaty of Versailles fails to preserve the kind of peace that they had hoped that it would preserve by punishing Germany so badly. Also remember that by the time that we get to the turn of the 1930s and the 20s are over, Germany's already been admitted into the League of Nations, as has Russia, I think by that point was in, and various other nations had been accepted. And so, you know, when we look at the initial punishment of the Treaty of Versailles, pretty much the Treaty of Versailles becomes a moot point by the time that we get to the 1930s, even though, to be clear, Hitler certainly didn't forget about the Treaty of Versailles, okay? He used the Treaty of Versailles, any chance that he could get to muster up national support for Germany by trashing the legacy of the Treaty of Versailles. Boy, he was chomping at the bit to do that. He is so adamantly hateful of the Treaty of Versailles and the French and the failed Weimar government that he actually finds the same. This is an amazing story, and actually I'm going to have you guys as part of your assignments over the course of the next several weeks here when we get into World War II. You'll hear this story again, but I got to tell it to you because it's one of the most amazing stories. It's so petty and it's so bitter, and it goes to illustrate just how real and angry and hot-headed the Germans were during this fascist Nazi period of rule, where Hitler, during World War II, after France capitulates inside of 6 weeks in World War II, in about June, late June, the mid to late June, the French drop out of the war, and much of France now falls under direct German administration. And when France falls out of World War II, he finds the exact same train car, that the Treaty of Versailles was signed in, that the Germans were forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles and accept the terms of the treaty, including the war guilt clause. He finds the exact same train car. He forces the French government to sit in the same place that the Germans did and sign the terms of their own defeat in World War II. And this is Hitler's revenge, exacted to a T. He finds the train car and forces them to sit in the same place that the Germans did when they were humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. So to be clear, even though the Treaty of Versailles was no longer being followed anymore for a long time, it was not forgotten by the Germans, this point of shame and national humiliation, the Treaty of Versailles, that they were forced to sign. And his way of getting revenge on them was to have them feel the same humiliation. This is the level of depth of anger and hate and pettiness that Hitler had for the French after the Treaty of Versailles terms were negotiated. So that's pretty amazing. You know, it's an amazing story in history. Oh, there's an echo in the audio. I apologize for that. Well, let me see if I can turn this down. Maybe I can do that. Maybe that'll help. Oh, shoot. I just spilled coffee all over myself. Give me 1 second. Good thing it's coffee and not soda or anything. Tell you what, life's never easy, kids. chairs out here, so I'm sitting in the wet chair. Oh yeah, I'm fine. I just spilled coffee everywhere, so I apologize. For that brief interruption. Karan, are you playing video games right now? What are you doing? Nicholas, you playing video games? What are you doing? What are you guys doing right now? No, you're not? I thought you said last time you were playing video games and listening to the lecture. Is that right? Maybe. I see. Yeah, the coffee was not hot coffee. It was iced coffee, so I still had to pick up a million ice cubes all over my floor. That's all right, though. Final Fantasy 15. I've never played that one before. All right, folks, I apologize about that. So, continuing on, talking about the idea that these nations, okay, were starting to get really aggressive, okay, and they were part of something called the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was supposed to be an international peacekeeping organization between the different nations involved, the member nations. Now, we don't have the League of Nations anymore. The League of Nations today is the United Nations. Okay, the League of Nations got dismantled at World War II. And then after World War II, there's a brand new international peacekeeping organization called United Nations, which we still have today. Now, look, the United Nations, to be honest with you, has quite a few problems with it in modern day times from my view. It doesn't always attract the nicest people, and they go into war-torn areas, and the United Nations has... I'm not saying it's not important. I think that the United Nations is important. We should have an international diplomatic community where nations can come together and talk about things before resorting to war. But the United Nations itself, there are problems within the organization where the peacekeeping forces of the United Nations are not always the best people on the planet, and they go to these places that are oftentimes war-torn and have humanitarian issues, and then they take advantage of their roles in those places. So the United Nations, I'm a little bit sketch about the United Nations, and that's my personal opinion. I know that there are also good people in the United Nations, and they also have done good things as well to prevent wars from breaking out in certain areas. But generally speaking, the United Nations is certainly not a perfect organization, although it is a necessary organization. And so at this time, the League of Nations had some flaws as well, different flaws than the United Nations has. The League of Nations' main problem is that there is no way of enforcing the resolutions that they come up with between the nations. So if Japan or if Germany starts to get hostile and invade, let's say, a sovereign nation that they shouldn't be in, or starts to do things against the wishes of the resolutions of the League of Nations, the League of Nations has no teeth. It's a toothless organization, so it can't bite back in the event that it is being undermined by a member nation. So when Japan invades China and they're like, hey, don't invade China. We told you can't invade nations that aren't your nation. And Japan's like, what are you going to do about it? And they're like, we're going to do absolutely nothing except for shake our finger very menacingly at you and say, hey, you can't do that. And Japan's like, boy, real scary there, right? Like, they don't care. And Germany takes a page right out of Japan's playbook when they invade Poland. The thing that you have to remember, why were these nations so hesitant to go to war? Well, we are only 19 or so years, 18 years after the end of World War I. World War I ended in 1918, November 11th, 1918. We are now in 1937, 19 years later. Japan invades China And European nations are afraid to get involved for a couple of reasons. Number one, Japan is not to be trifled with. They're a nation in the Far East. The European nations feel like they have less leeway in places like China by this point because the age of imperialism has largely concluded. Okay, it's not over with, but the age of going and colonizing new places is kind of 30 years too late now, 40 years too late. And so we're seeing increasingly more places actually breaking away from colonial rule after World War II. But Japan goes into China, and Europe doesn't want to get bogged down in Asian affairs. They don't even want to get bogged down in European wars. Why would they want to go and get involved in an Asian conflict over on the other side of the continent? Well, they don't. And that's another reason that they let Hitler get away with as much as he does right in their own backyards. People are still traumatized after World War I. They don't want to go to war. They're afraid. Okay, they're afraid of going to war and what that might mean. The horrors of trench warfare are still very much at the forefront of people's minds. The feelings of loss, the feelings of hopelessness. The last thing France wants, the last thing Britain wants, is to get involved in another global conflict. But you'll find that Hitler gives them no other choice. When he invades Poland, Britain finally steps up to the plate and says, that's the last straw. You've been pushing your limit for years now. We've been giving in to you. This is a policy known as appeasement. So when we talk about appeasement, it's giving in to the demands of an aggressive entity. Let's say it's a toddler at the checkout lane in the grocery store. Appeasement is if you have a crying baby in the grocery store and they ask you for a candy bar and you say no, and then they throw a tantrum and then you give in to the tantrum. You are then appeasing the baby. And that is both bad parenting, but also you're going to train a baby that's really, really annoying because it will learn that when it cries, it gets what it wants. This is essentially the policy that they had towards Hitler. The British basically came to Berlin in, Munich, actually. It was Munich. The British go to Munich. The prime minister of the time is a guy named Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain goes to Munich in 1938. I think it's September of 1938, and he meets with Hitler. This is pre-World War II. Neville Chamberlain goes and talks to Hitler and says, look, you've been more aggressive. We understand your goals for creating a German nation that's proud about being German again and stuff like that. That's fine. But the Sudetenland, that borderland area around Czechoslovakia, that's the last time that we're doing this. This is the last straw, and we are now considering Germany satisfied. And Hitler kind of has his fingers crossed and behind his back and says, yes, of course. Germany is now satisfied. We're not going to be aggressive anymore. Germany's a peaceful nation. We simply want those lands which should be Germany's lands. And so, Neville Chamberlain gets done meeting with Hitler, flies back to England, gets off the plane, holds up the contract that he got Hitler to sign, and says, I believe I have secured peace for our time. 11 months later, Hitler invades Poland. And that's exactly the point. When you appease a guy like Hitler, he is just going to continue to push and push and push and push that boundary. If you watched the second episode of that docuseries, you can see in that actor's portrayal of Hitler how backstabbing he is. Okay? He will promise you one thing to your face. He will turn right around and stab you in the back. And he does not care. He doesn't feel pity or remorse about it because to him, it's all Machiavellian style politics. The ends justify the means. If I get my way and that means I have to stab you in the back or commit some other crimes against humanity, I'm going to do it. It is a ruthless attitude towards politics and towards, frankly, human rights. I mean, we see under Hitler some of the worst abuses of human rights in all of history, documented and recorded in things like the Holocaust and all the medical experiments and so on and so forth. When you have a guy who is willing to sanction these kinds of policies, you can't trust him. And so he keeps pushing that boundary and pushing that boundary and pushing that boundary until finally the British say, look, enough's enough. We're not going to let this stand anymore. But then they kind of do. And that's because when they declare war against Germany, Germany has, both Britain and France declare war simultaneously against Germany when he invades Poland. But the thing that's so funny about that, and what we'll find out, is that actually they don't go to war right away. They declare war right away, but they don't go to war right away. There's a period of time in the start of World War II where there's basically not much that happens. War has been declared, but no one's really fighting. Not at least between the British and the French and the Germans. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more. Going back to bring you, I'm kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but to bring it back a little bit, let's talk a little more about what goes on in Japan. Now, Japan had some elements of democracy. They had been actually a little bit more democratic in a pre-stock crash time. Okay, in the 1920s, we see some elements of democracy exhibited in Japan. However, as time goes on, when the Great Depression hits and the stock market crashes, citizens very quickly turn to blaming the Japanese government for not being proactive enough about shoring up their own interests. Now, in case you don't know this about Japan, Japan is they're an island, and they're a very mountainous island. Unlike England, which is a lot of like marshy swamplands and things like that, and it has a lot of arable land, Japan has very little by way of natural resources, and it's very hard for Japan to operate in a world of the Great Depression where trade goes down significantly. Japan gets in situations, even with the COVID virus and other things like that, but particularly in an older time last century, Japan is really heavily influenced by the Great Depression because they rely so heavily on trade. And when the Great Depression hits, all of these different nations are looking out for their own countries. So nations start to pass laws that protect their at-home economy. So America is looking out for America. Germany's looking out for Germany. Russia's looking out for Russia. But what does Japan have? Japan has limited resources, and they are really relying on trade. So when these nations start looking out for themselves, world trade drops significantly. And what this results in is Japan having a disproportionately hard time in the Great Depression because of the diminished global trade that takes place, where Japan was very reliant on that trade. Military leaders end up taking over in high positions in government, and Emperor Hirohito becomes essentially a figure of power. But the true people in control after the stock market crashes and the Great Depression takes place are going to be your high-ranking military officials of the Japanese Imperial Army. Now, Emperor Hirohito was the Emperor of Japan, and he remained the Emperor of Japan. But like I say, even though he's viewed as a living god, the people who are really in power in the Japanese government at this point are going to be high-ranking military figures, not necessarily the day-to-day decisions being made by the Emperor himself. So, Japan invades Manchuria, also known as Manchukuo, which is northern China. Now, Japan had been in the League of Nations, remember, but when they invade China, and the League of Nations says, hey, you can't do that, they're like, well, stop us then. And then they leave. They just quit. They stop showing up to the League of Nations meetings, and everybody's like, okay, I guess that's how that's going to go now. So 4 years later, they invaded mainland China. So they were already in Korea by this point. They had basically completely taken over the Korean Peninsula back in the 1900s, I think 1908. Is when they annex all of the Korean Peninsula, and then they invade in Manchuria. They had been in northern China for a while, and then they start moving their way systematically southwards and taking lands. Now, at that time, I don't know if you remember talking about this, we actually learned a lot about China leading up to the start of World War II. We talked about how there was that long march, and China had been facing problems internally where they were fighting a civil war. There was a Chinese civil war going on between the Kuomintang, which is the Chinese Nationalist Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek, who had the upper hand in the 1930s and into the start of the 1940s. But then what ends up happening is he was chasing down the communists led by Mao Zedong. So it's the nationalist Kuomintang against the Communist Party led by Mao Zedong. And and what ends up happening is that they actually sign a truce with one another, not really a peace treaty, but they sign a truce with one another to join forces because Japan is invading, and that's going to be a much bigger problem if these major Chinese cities get taken over by the Japanese military. So Chiang Kai-shek's army fell, and Japan faced new problems from Mao Zedong throughout World War II. So Japan is one of these nations, like Germany, like Italy, that falls to fascism during this time. Extreme aggressive nationalism. And so the League of Nations had demonstrated that it could not stop Japan. Okay, Japan broke the rules. When they were called out on breaking the rules, they end up just quitting the League completely. And Germany and Italy realized, like, whoa, Japan can just, like, what, break the rules and not be reprimanded for it? Sounds like a good deal. Maybe we'll do the same thing. So Mussolini, for example, attacks Ethiopia at that time. The British and French do nothing about that. They want to appease these aggressive fascist states by giving in to their demands so that it preserves them from having to go to war. Germany starts defying blatant aspects of the Treaty of Versailles. For example, I told you about that area known as the Rhineland, the area around the Rhine River. Excuse me. The Rhineland was supposed to be a demilitarized buffer zone between Germany and France, but Germany takes in 1936, March 7th, 1936, and they march their own troops right into what was supposed to be this demilitarized zone. And this is, of course, really hostile. This is really aggressive. Now, they are German lands. They are marching their military into their own lands. You would think that they should be able to do that. But the idea being that it's in defiance of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, where this land was supposed to be not occupied by any military, but especially not occupied by the German military. So in 1936, when he does this, this is Hitler thumbing his nose at France, saying we can move our military wherever we want. And they, of course, welcomed with open arms by the Germans in that area of Western Germany in the Rhineland, because they had not seen German troops allowed in there for about 15 years or so following the Treaty of Versailles. You have Spain, which is facing a civil war at this time as well. There was a very weak government in Spain at this time. Hitler and Mussolini wanted Spain to become fascist. They have a leader named Francisco Franco, who became the first fascist dictator of Spain. But again, I want to remind you that even though Spain is fascist, they have a lot of problems at this time that are going to prevent them from even being on a par with Italy, which Italy is nowhere even close to being as fascist or totalitarian as Germany is. And so Spain's fascist leader, Francisco Franco, even though he is technically fascist, they don't really play any significant role in the grand scheme of things because of all the turmoil happening in Spain at that time. And Francisco Franco's power was certainly was certainly anything but absolute. It was very challenged by anarchists and others who were in Spain at that time. So they called him Generalissimo Franco. Generalissimo Franco. So United States, what are we doing at this time? I'm just trying to set up politically everything going into World War II. United States is just basically kicking it on their side of the ocean. They're just chilling, man. They don't care about what's going on in Europe. They're still dealing with their own problems with the Great Depression, right, which is set in. They got the Dust Bowl going on. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the president at this time. He's initiated a number of new laws called the New Deal, which set up programs that help the United States to get out of the Great Depression by putting people to work. And some of these New Deal plans you'll learn about next year in U.S. history. I'm not going to go into the details of those because I won't be asking you deliberate test questions about it this year. But the idea being that the United States is really practicing something called isolationism at this time. They're basically just isolating themselves kicking their feet up on our side of the ocean, trying to put people back to work, dealing with the problems of the Dust Bowl, dealing with the problems of the Great Depression, and kind of keeping an ear on what's going on in Europe, but not getting involved in anything that's going on over there. Hitler, during this time, forms the Third Reich. Now, that phrase, the Third Reich, refers to the Nazi Party, Nazi rule of Germany. So whenever you hear Third Reich, you should immediately be thinking Hitler, Nazis, World War II, Holocaust, all that sort of stuff. All right, all of this is initiated by the Third Reich. What does it mean? Well, the First Reich, allegedly, is the first rise of the German people in the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, so the Holy Roman Empire is viewed as the original First Reich, the rise of the German people. Then there was the Second Reich, which was the German Empire created by Otto von Bismarck. And so that German Empire was the first time that Germany gets unified after the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. And then the Third Reich was supposedly Germany's supposed to be the 1,000-year reign of the Nazis in Germany, but of course it does not last 1,000 years. It doesn't even last 10 years. Well, it barely lasts. It lasts about 12 years. All right, and so this is the Third Reich, and then it is vanquished at the end of World War II when the Germans are defeated, in case you didn't know. He absorbed also in his land grabbing, I mentioned Czechoslovakia earlier, even prior to that, he absorbed Austria. Actually, Hitler was from Austria originally. And so he annexes Austria. He annexes the Sudetenland and then all of Czechoslovakia. And he remilitarizes the Rhineland. And so these are some of the aggressive moves that Hitler is making in the 1930s, leading up to the start of World War II. And then the thing that kicks off World War II, in Europe at least, is Hitler invading Poland. That's the most immediate cause of getting France and Britain involved. Okay, now keep in mind too, France and Britain had pledged to protect Czechoslovakia. They had pledged to protect Austria, but it's really hard to protect Austria because Austria, this was something called the Anschluss, by the way. When Germany takes over Austria and annexes them, absorbs them into the German Third Reich under Hitler, this was called the Anschluss. A-N-S-C-H-L-U-S-S. Anschluss. Okay, and this happens in 1938. But to be honest with you, I have a little bit of a qualm with the Anschluss. There's a memorial in Vienna, which is the capital of Austria, that's like praising resistance to being taken over by the Nazis leading up to World War II. And I always kind of cringe a little bit at that because it's like there might have been some Austrians who didn't want to be absorbed into Germany. There were some people who resisted, sure. There were people who were morally against being taken over by Germany, but there was also a whole lot of people in Austria that were not morally against being taken over by Germany, and they were excited about the prospect of being absorbed into Germany because remember, after World War I, Austria is this tiny little nation. Okay, the entire map of Europe got redrawn after the Treaty of Versailles is negotiated, and so Austria had lost a tremendous amount of land, and they were looking to be absorbed at this point into big, strong Germany up north that could, offer them some new, perhaps economic and industrial development that they did not have before. Keep in mind, too, that Hitler had been pretty effective in his early years, if nothing else, at trying to turn the German economy around and put people to work. And the Great Depression, having such an effect everywhere on the globe, meant that Austria, too, was affected by it. And they kind of look at this as an opportunity maybe in 1938 to have some better employment and as I said a minute ago, new industrial opportunities there as well. So there were a lot of folks in Austria that weren't too sad about being absorbed into. I always feel like, let's not take it too far here with putting up a thing about resisting the German takeover in the Anschluss, because there was an awful lot of people in the Austrian nation that were fine with being taken over by Hitler at that time due to the economic changes that they had seen happen under his rule just to the north. I told you earlier the story about the Munich conference where Chamberlain, famous last words, gets back to London and says, "I believe I have secured peace for our time," and then 11 months later, World War II starts. Those were his last words, and that's why at the start of World War II, Neville Chamberlain gets voted out. He faces, I think he even faced a vote of no confidence in his rule. There was a potential that people could bring a vote to oust him in Parliament and in the House of Commons, and that's when we see Winston Churchill take over as Prime Minister in 1940. So France and Britain agreed at that time at the Munich conference to giving Hitler the Sudetenland, but then shortly thereafter he just ends up absorbing all of Czechoslovakia afterwards. All right, so that brings us to one last thing I got to talk about before I switch gears here, and that is that Hitler does one other real clever thing before he invades Poland, and that is he reaches out to Stalin. Now, this was really unprecedented because Nazis, fascists in general, remember I told you last time, they're going to be far, far right. They're really, really far right. They're really far conservative. They're really super nationalistic, and they hate communists who are on the opposite end of the political spectrum. They're super, super far left. Okay, so the communists are going to be seen as super, super radical to the other side of the political spectrum. So Nazis and fascists on one side do not get along politically with communists on the other, and they have very different political ideologies. And if you want to know more about that, again, I encourage you to go back and watch that lecture that I did on Monday where I talk about a lot of these differences between these political ideologies of communism and fascism. But suffice it to say, it was a surprise to everyone on the world, but especially the world's democracies at this time, talking Britain, France, United States. Why would the Nazis, the fascists of Germany, reach out to Stalin and sign a pact with him? So the Nazis send a guy, his name was Joachim von Ribbentrop, and they send Joachim von Ribbentrop to sign. He was the foreign minister for the Nazi party in Germany, which, by the way, is systematically making themselves the single party in Germany. They are making other political parties illegal by this point. By the time that we're on the eve of World War II, all other political parties have been made illegal in Germany. So the Nazis are the only legal political party. They have total control of the government at this point. And they send Joachim von Ribbentrop, their foreign minister, to negotiate, to broker a deal with the communist totalitarian dictator Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, aka Russia. Why would they do it? Well, it's because behind closed doors there was a secret plan going on. And the secret plan that these two guys had, Stalin and Hitler, had agreed privately behind closed doors that when they invade Poland, they're going to both invade it from either side, Germany from the west, Russia from the east, and then they're going to split up the spoils of war and divide those territories between the two of them. Now, historically, the Polish people had only had a state for a short time because the Polish state had been taken up, it had been gobbled up by Austria-Hungary, it had been gobbled up by Russia, and it had been gobbled up by Prussia going back to the late 1700s. There was something called the Partitions of Poland of 1772. And these partitions of Poland had basically made it so that Poland as a state didn't exist for a long time. And then they create Poland as a brand new state after World War I. And remember, they had cut that swath of land out to give Poland access to the Baltic Sea from German territories. This was seen as a monstrosity to Hitler. And it's one of the big reasons that he wanted to invade Poland was to take back that Danzig corridor back for Germany. But the private agreement that didn't get printed in the newspapers was the reason we are signing a pact with Russia is to make ourselves seem like we're a nice peaceful state and that we don't want to step on anyone's toes, except for the Polish, and then take over those lands. But the secret agreement was, oh yeah, Hitler's going to invade from the west, Stalin's going to invade from the east, and we're going to take those two territories, divide them up between our two nations, and call them ours now. And we'll have a nice peaceful border between Russia and Germany in the meantime. Now, Hitler wrongly predicted when he invaded Poland that the British and the French wouldn't get involved. They do get involved, but he had reason to think that they wouldn't. Remember, they had been giving in to basically every single aggressive demand that he had been making on them for the past 10 years or so. So when Hitler gives in, when the British and the French give in to Hitler's demands, he has no reason to think that when he invades Poland that they're actually going to respond this time. But they do. Even though they don't militarily get involved right away, they do at least on principle oppose his expansionist efforts into Poland to secure Lebensraum, living space, according to him. Now, it does surprise people that Hitler would make an agreement with the people that he hated so much in his own nation, the communists. At this time, communists are being driven out underground, being put into jail illegally and stuff like that in Germany by the Nazis. They are already the communists were being treated very poorly in Germany at this time. They were considered enemies of the state. They were considered traitorous. And of course, communists make up a sizable number of the people who were sent to the concentration camps. So the communists and the fascists don't get along. So why would they sign it? It's basically to divide up Poland. Also, though, you should know that down the line, Hitler will, as he always does, push boundaries and stab people in the back. And this is what he does with Stalin too. Stalin never really trusted Hitler, to be honest with you. They never trusted one another. Stalin's not an idiot. They knew that this was all about dividing Poland up. But Stalin's also just as cutthroat, maybe even worse than Hitler in terms of how disconnected he is with any sort of sense of empathy or God, he was just a brutal dictator. And so Stalin and Hitler are kind of cut from the same totalitarian cloth. And as a result of that, Stalin and Hitler have some of the same apparatuses in place, like secret police and prison camps and other things like that. They use all of the same techniques, instilling fear, using purges to get rid of their competitors. All of those classic totalitarian moves are things that both of these guys utilize. And so there's not much surprise that these two, if you will, evildoers end up at each other's throats later on in the war. And of course Hitler completely backstabs Stalin and ends up going over onto Soviet territory with something called Operation Barbarossa, which we'll learn about when we start learning about World War II in another couple of classes here. So here's what's coming down the pike, folks. Today I'm going to give you kind of like a lesson pertaining to some of these totalitarian, rise of Hitler, rise of Stalin, rise of Japan, fascist type of thing. It's going to be like a quizzes or something like that. Just a little bit of a review quiz assignment or whatever. I am going to have an online test for this. It will be optional, as all of these assignments will be, but it'll be an online test that I'll do for next class for the online lesson on Friday. I'll have that made up hopefully by then. Maybe I'll wait until, no, it's got to be on Friday because I don't really have any more left to lecture on from this unit. So interwar years, we're pretty much coming to a close on that, and I'd like to switch gears and move on to World War II next so we can talk about that. And so there will be an assignment kind of reviewing all of these concepts from this unit, interwar years. That includes all of the scientific changes and other things like that. And I can make some of these assignments worth a little bit more if I deem that it takes more effort to move your guys' grades in the right direction. So if you're feeling like 5 points an assignment isn't going to work, or if I feel like 5 points an assignment isn't enough, I will weigh these distance instruction assignments more so that they have a little bit more beneficial impact on your grade. Maybe make them worth 10 each or something like that, so that you can feel like, hey, I'm doing something in class and it's helping out my grade, and hey, I'm learning a thing or two while I'm at it. So here's what I'm going to do here for the rest of this time is I'm going to upload an assignment to you in the brand new folder on Schoology, that pink folder in distance lesson 2. We'll say test on Friday, but remember it's just worth extra credit points, basically. Okay, so test on Friday. Yeah, test. Okay, if you want to call it that. But it'll just be your distance instruction assignment for that day. It's no different than any of the other assignments I give you. You either do them or you don't do them. They can't hurt you, but potentially they could help you. Okay, so that's basically the lesson on that. Basically, all I was trying to say is, if you feel like the points aren't having enough of an impact, I can make the points worth more. I don't want to make it worth too much and then have to scale it back. I'd rather have it worth too little and then have some control over how much it affects long term over time. I just don't know how much, adding randomly 75 points into the grade book for the next month and a half or however long we're in school is going to affect grades long term. So I'm afraid that if I make it worth too much, everybody will just randomly have A's. If I make it worth too little, it won't affect people's grades enough. I just have never had to do anything like this before, so I'm trying to find the right balance for what things are worth to affect your grade, doing stuff consistently over time. Okay. All right. All right, folks. Well, I am going to update Schoology right now. Before I sign off, are there any questions here about today's lesson on, kind of the lead up to World War II? If you have questions, feel free to ask them right now or send me a message on Schoology, and I'll get back to you. In the next few minutes here, I'll have this all fixed up and ready to go for the assignment, for the quizzes assignment, which is going to be stuff about the interwar years. Everything will be pertaining to interwar years. All right. Well, if there are no questions, I just wanted to make sure that I gave you some time in case you wanted to type something in while I have you here in front of me. But if there are no questions, then I will leave it here and I will sign off for the day. And I will immediately, right after signing off of this, I'm going to put up that quizzes assignment for you so you can do that as a distance instruction assignment for today. And I'll make sure to get that into the grade book at the end of the week here. I'm going to wait for, basically I'll be updating the grades every week. So look for maybe on Saturday or Sunday for me to update the grade book with the assignments that you did for Monday, Wednesday, Friday of this week. Okay. All right, folks. Well, take care, everyone. And thank you so much for tuning in today. And make sure to tune in on Friday morning and I'll give you more instructions then on what we're going to do. All right. Have a great day.